While the public was preparing to ring in the new year, the US Senate was busy passing the FISA Amendments Act extension to continue the US warrantless spying program in the name of the war on terror. As critics like MI5 whistleblower Annie Machon point out, however, the Anglophone world has already had these powers for decades under the Echelon system. This is the GRTV Feature Interview with your host James Corbett and our special guest, Annie Machon. Well, Ms. Machon, today I wanted to talk about a very interesting post that you made towards the beginning of the year, as during the Christmas break, the New Year's break, when most people were partying and paying attention to other things, the U.S. Congress was busy, actually the Senate was busy passing in a FISA Amendment Act extension. And this is an extremely interesting little piece of legislation that, unfortunately, sadly, quite an indictment, I think, has received almost no attention whatsoever in the mainstream media, and even the alternative media has largely let this pass under the radar. So perhaps you can tell us a little bit about the FISA Amendment Act and why this extension is important.
Well, this is an interesting one because it extends the powers of the intelligence agencies, all 16 of them in the US, basically allowing the intelligence infrastructure to hoover up information, electronic communications, sent by Americans to anyone abroad. And of course, there have, in the past, there were very strict controls saying that organizations such as the CIA could not investigate aggressively American citizens. But this little extension allows them now to eavesdrop and to look at who you're talking to and all that sort of thing. And it's interesting, the timing, as you mentioned, because again, 12 months ago, just after Christmas, I think it was the 31st of December 2011, President Obama indeed signed another act which eroded American citizens' rights within America, which was the NDAA, which allowed him to extrajudicially deal with people who are deemed to be enemies of the state within America, even if they're American citizens. Just as, since 9/11, the US has been extrajudicially dealing with people they deem to be a threat to America outside America. So it's very interesting that they seem to use the holiday period to sneak through all sorts of horrible new laws that erode the basic constitution of America and the rights of everybody around the world, and they expect to get away with it. Sadly, they do.
That is very sad, and of course in this case it has to do with the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, which was is set up as a way of basically rubber stamping warrants for the NSA and agencies to spy on the conversations of people suspected of being involved in terror, etc. But in order to even get around that rubber stamp court, the Bush administration basically signed an executive order trying to get around that, and the FISA Amendment Act was part of that, basically doing an end run around that entire process and putting it into law. And unfortunately, that has been extended with very few senators being even bothering to oppose this legislation. But interestingly enough, you had a post on your website pointing out an aspect of this that I hadn't seen covered really on any of the other alternative media websites, and that's it's a post called Echelon Redux, in which you make the point that really FISA amendment and all of this is to a certain extent window dressing to cover up the fact that for all intents and purposes, the intelligence agencies, the alphabet soup agencies, have had the ability to do this type of warrantless wiretapping for a long time through the Echelon network, which still receives very little attention, even though it's been exposed for over 2 decades now. Perhaps you can tell us a little bit about Echelon, what it is, and how we came to find out about it.
Well, Echelon is a very frightening setup. It was exposed in the 1980s by a very good investigative journalist in the UK called Duncan Campbell and a very good journalist in New Zealand called Nikki Hagar. And then Duncan revisited it because he had to give evidence to the European Parliament in 1999. But basically what we have here is an old setup where the agencies, the eavesdropping agencies of the US, the UK, Canada, New Zealand, and Australia, so all the English-speaking Anglophone sphere of the world, had an agreement whereby they could legally eavesdrop on people outside their own territories without having to go through the hassle of getting any sort of warrantry, any sort of political oversight or permission to do that. And because of the Echelon agreement, they would then share that information with their partners. So, for example, in the UK, since the 1980s, the intelligence agencies have not been allowed to eavesdrop on UK citizens without getting warrants from the politicians who are notionally their political masters. Even the UK listening post, GCHQ, Government Communications Headquarters, which is like the American NSA, had to get a warrant to do anything which might involve UK citizens. So this Echelon agreement allowed, for example, GCHQ to ask the NSA, who could legally eavesdrop on people in the UK without a warrant, to hoover up the information they wanted and then send it through to them. And then just in the same way as a reciprocal arrangement, we had the NSA saying to GCHQ, oh, we've got some calls we'd like you to pick up in the UK, in the US, sorry, without any sort of warrantry because you're snooping on a foreign country, and then give us the information. So for decades, we have had a situation where all the eavesdropping spy agencies have been able to share this sort of information within the Anglophone sphere. And it has sidestepped whatever democratic window dressing has been put in place, both in the US with the Constitution and with various intelligence protocols, and also in the UK, where we've had a series of laws such as the IOCA Interception of Communications Act 1985, RIPA, which is a Regulation of Investigatory Powers Act 2000, which was supposed to protect the privacy of UK-US citizens. But by having this very close sharing relationship between the NSA and GCHQ, certainly, they've managed to sidestep all these democratic oversight mechanisms anyway. So, as you say, FISA is a sort of window dressing. It's putting on a more formal footing the fact that the government can spy on its citizens. And I think one point perhaps that's interesting is they want it to be known. They want people to know that they can be spied on now because the tech is there, and it's becoming much more endemic. And I think it's a way of sort of censoring the population or making the populations self-censor themselves.
I think you're exactly right on that, and of course that plays on the idea of the Panopticon, which is an idea not only for an actual prison that was developed by Jeremy Bentham back in the 18th century, but also for a psychological phenomenon where prisoners can be made to police themselves if they feel like they're being watched at all times. So what does it say about our society that we've come to the point where this type of thing can be openly admitted and yet not even basically covered or just covered on a surface level as a passing mention in the newspapers? Have we arrived at that stage where we have completely internalized this police state?
I think we're certainly getting very close to it. There's a wonderful talk, I would recommend anyone to try and track it down on the internet while it's still free, by a man called Professor Aben Moglen, who is the Columbia law professor, and he's been campaigning on these issues for many years. And he did a wonderful talk at an event called Re Publica in Berlin. It can be found, in fact, on the front page at the moment of my website, saying that free thought demands free media. And what he means by free media is media where we are not policed at all times, where we are not conscious that our communications or what we download, what we ingest, what we read, what we watch, what we listen to is being monitored all the time. And there are still certain ways to get around it. But these new laws coming out and being promulgated by our governments are making us much more afraid. It's a bit like you go back to the 1930s with the Nazi book burnings. These are forbidden books. You're not allowed to read them. They're dangerous. They might corrupt our youth. And now this sort of endemic knowledge that whatever we might download, whatever we might read, whatever we might write, can be hoovered up by the spy agencies and used against us as the laws shift and change in the future, does or can lead to self-censorship. And this is a real danger for any notional democracy. So, the idea of the Panopticon is frightening. And I think also one other point is, I've sort of jokingly said for years now that TV shows like Big Brother, where you're watched 24 hours a day, and if you're lucky, you win and you get a C-list celeb lifestyle or something, or even social media organizations like Facebook are grooming us to the idea that sharing all our information, exposing ourselves out there on the internet, allowing people to watch us all the time. It's a bit like pedophiles grooming child victims. They are normalizing this endemic surveillance culture, and I think it's very dangerous.
That's unfortunately, I think, a very apt analogy, and absolutely a very disturbing overall societal phenomenon. And let's put that in a broader context, because there's not only the drive that's being put on us at a societal level to get us to share our personal information, but then there's also the demonization of sharing of other sorts of information, for example, through peer-to-peer file sharing. and the use of the term piracy and all of that political brouhaha surrounding that. And on that note, you had a recent post, The End of Privacy and Freedom of Thought, talking about the fact that Telstra is implementing deep packet inspection technology to throttle peer-to-peer sharing over the internet. That's a lot of tech speak for people. Perhaps you can break down a little bit what that means and why this is an important part of this puzzle.
Well, it's also a lot of tech speak for someone who is trained to be a classicist. So pardon me if I get any of the tech wrong, to say that in advance of the techies. But no, my understanding is that peer-to-peer sharing, the whole sort of Tor onion framework, where you can tunnel under the internet and maintain your privacy, which is what a lot of hacktivist geek people do already. And this is how big file sharing sites like Mega Upload or the Pirate Bay have managed to keep people relatively, and also people and media free, is now being threatened, because as soon as you get into the point where you're looking at the individual packets of information going over the internet, you can see everything. And the trouble is that if you use the excuse, for example, that big entertainment companies need this in order to see if their films are being ripped off, they need this tech to get in and actually look at the individual packets of information going. Once that is in place, of course, it'll be used and abused by everybody, down to and including the intelligence agencies, the police infrastructure, the apparatus that is now monitoring us. So as soon as the tool is in place, it will be abused. And the whole idea of copyright, of not pirating films or music or whatever, I see as a sort of stalking horse, a reason why they then get the capability to do this. And I mean, it's seen very clearly, for example, with the arrest of Kim.com in New Zealand last year. I mean, it was a wrongful arrest. It broke many, many international and national New Zealand laws. And they took down his file sharing site, Mega Upload, on very spurious grounds. Now, he hadn't broken any laws. What he offered was a service, effectively, where people could park information, a bit like Google Docs. So most of the customers using it were legitimate clients, businesses, renting space. They could share documents, they could work on documents, they could share media, whatever, which was theirs. Then, of course, other people did use it as a mechanism of uploading and downloading media, which is copyrighted. And that was the excuse to take down this legitimate site in an illegal way. And we've seen this again also in the UK. Various people like Richard O'Dwyer, who's a student, set up a company called TV Shack, which offered the same services. And it was a sort of signpost website that showed you where you could go to download media for free. He hadn't broken any laws. He was not hosting any copyright material in the UK. The UK authorities had no interest in prosecuting him whatsoever, and yet they still threatened him with extradition to the US, where he would face 10 years maximum security prison time for doing something which was perfectly legal in his own country. So we're seeing this sort of mission creep around the issues of copyright and piracy, which then will be abused by this, our national intelligence infrastructures. And I think it's a sort of symptom of corporatization and corporatism, which of course is the Mussolini definition of fascism, where the merger of the state and the corporations takes place, and the state becomes subject to the will and whims of the corporations to keep their profits in place.
For more on this story and other breaking news and current events, please go to globalresearch.ca. For more research and analysis by James Corbett, please go to corbettreport.com.